The streets of South Jamaica, Queens, are quiet now. The night hangs heavy, as though the air itself remembers. The glow of distant street lamps bounces off brick walls and cracked pavement, illuminating a neighborhood that once pulsed with a different kind of life. Tonight, there are no corner lookouts, no shouting voices, no cars creeping by with tinted windows. Only the faint hum of the city far away and the occasional rustle of wind through trash-strewn alleys. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of a time when these streets were ruled by a man whose name carried both fear and respect. Kenneth Supreme McGriff. This is not just the story of a gangster, nor simply the rise and fall of a drug empire. It is the story of a man who saw the chaos of his world and turned it into power, a man who carved out a kingdom in the middle of one of New York's toughest neighborhoods. To some, he was a villain, flooding the streets with poison and leaving a trail of blood behind him. To others, he was a provider, a symbol of success, the man who proved that even from the bottom, you could reach the top, if you were willing to pay the price. The legend of Supreme does not start with a bang, but with a whisper. In the 1970s, South Jamaica was a place defined by survival. Factories were shutting down, jobs were disappearing, and families were struggling to put food on the table. The streets raised their children quickly, and they learned that respect was earned not with words, but with action. Kenneth McGriff was one of those kids, watching, learning, absorbing the rhythm of his neighborhood. He saw the dealers with their Cadillacs, the hustlers with their stacks of cash, the way people moved aside when certain men walked by. It was intoxicating. But tonight, we are not rushing to the end of his story. This is not a tale to be told in quick headlines. We are going to sit with it, breathe it in, and travel back through the years. Picture the world as it was then, corner bodegas with metal grates pulled halfway down, the smell of fried food drifting through the summer air, block parties that brought music to the streets even as gunshots sometimes cut through the rhythm. This was the world Kenneth knew, the world that would shape him into Supreme. There was a discipline to him even as a young man, a presence that made people pay attention. He was not the loudest, not the wildest, but he was the one with a plan. People remember how he carried himself, calm, confident, never rushed. He understood that the streets were not just about muscle, they were about strategy. And that strategy would one day make him one of the most powerful men in the New York drug trade. For now, though, imagine him as a teenager, walking past the rows of brick housing projects, nodding to the older guys who ran the block. He studied everything, how they organized, how they kept outsiders in check, how they made money flow through their hands like water. He learned who to trust and who to avoid. And slowly, piece by piece, he began building a name for himself. When people talk about Supreme, they often speak in mythic tones. The Supreme team became more than just a crew, they became a brand, a name that sent shivers through rivals and earned respect from allies. But that is still to come. For now, we are at the beginning of the road, when everything was still possible. Before the indictments, before the trials, before the life sentences. There is a kind of peace in remembering the early days, when the empire was just an idea, a dream waiting to be built. As you settle into this story, allow yourself to picture the streets as they were. The yellow glow of streetlights reflected on rain-slick pavement, the sound of distant music from a passing car, the muted conversations of people leaning against walls, talking about money, opportunity, and survival. In that world, Kenneth Supreme McGriff began to see himself as something greater than just another kid from Queens. He was observant, almost quiet, but his presence carried weight. Friends would say later that Supreme had a gift for making people feel like they were part of something bigger. He saw beyond the corner, beyond the block, he saw possibility. And it was this vision that would transform him from a neighborhood hustler into a kingpin. Yet, even now, as we remember his rise, there is an undercurrent of inevitability. Every king who builds a throne must one day face the challenge of keeping it. Every empire attracts enemies, from within and without. And Supreme's story is no exception. His rise would bring money, power, and respect, but it would also bring danger, betrayal, and tragedy. Tonight, we begin at the very start, before the first brick of his empire was laid, before the first corner was claimed in his name. This is the quiet before the storm, the calm before the chaos. It is here, in the stillness of South Jamaica, that we first meet Kenneth McGriff, a young man who would soon become supreme. And as the night deepens, we will follow his story, through ambition and bloodshed, through triumph and downfall, until we understand the man behind the legend. For now, let the streets fade into the background. Let the hum of the city lull you into the rhythm of this tale. The world outside can wait. Tonight, we walk step by step through history, and we do it slowly, carefully, like following footprints in the dark. The story of Supreme is just beginning, and what comes next will take us deeper into a world where loyalty is life, and betrayal is death. The 1970s were a turbulent time for Queens. To truly understand Kenneth Supreme McGriff, you have to step back and see the world that shaped him. South Jamaica was a neighborhood of contradictions. By day, it was full of kids playing stickball in the street, mothers sitting on stoops gossiping, and the sound of radios crackling with Motown and early disco. By night, the energy shifted, shadowy figures took over the corners, deals were whispered in alleyways, and the occasional pop of a gunshot broke the silence like a warning bell. The economy was changing, and not for the better. The factories and blue-collar jobs that once supported families were disappearing. Crime rates were climbing. The city was in a financial crisis, and entire neighborhoods felt abandoned by those in power. Streetlights would go unrepaired, garbage piled up on curbs, and the police seemed either too far away or too close, depending on who you asked. For many young men growing up in this environment, the path to success looked blocked at every turn. College seemed distant. Corporate America might as well have been on another planet. But the streets, those were right there, open for business. Kenneth grew up watching this reality play out. He saw friends, cousins, neighbors pulled into the hustle, some making quick money, others meeting violent ends. He saw how fast respect could be gained, and how quickly it could be lost. It was an education, one that taught lessons no school could offer: who to fear, who to trust, when to speak, and when to stay silent. The neighborhood wasn't all darkness, though. There was a deep sense of community in those blocks, a code of looking out for one another. Church services on Sundays still drew crowds. Block parties were legendary, bringing people together with music, food, and dance. Kenneth was shaped by both sides, the warmth of the community and the hard edge of the streets. He learned early that survival meant knowing how to move between both worlds. Imagine a young Kenneth standing on the corner, taking it all in. The faint smell of weed in the air, the rumble of subway trains in the distance, the flashing lights of police cruisers slowly rolling past. He wasn't the loudest kid on the block, but there was something about him, something watchful, calculating. Friends would later say he had a way of seeing 2 steps ahead, of thinking like a chess player while everyone else was still playing checkers. At this time, heroin was the drug of choice in New York, and its presence was everywhere. Dealers would operate out of apartments, using lookouts to warn of police, and addicts would nod off on park benches. Kenneth saw the damage it did: families torn apart, lives wasted. But he also saw the money it brought in. The men who controlled the flow of drugs were feared and respected, and they lived better than anyone else in the neighborhood. For a young man who wanted more out of life, who wanted to rise above poverty, that kind of power was magnetic. The streets taught discipline in their own harsh way. If you weren't careful, you got robbed. If you weren't tough, you got pushed aside. Kenneth learned to carry himself with quiet confidence. He wasn't reckless. He didn't start fights for no reason. Instead, he observed, he planned, and when the time came, he acted with precision. This would become one of his defining traits: patience. Where others rushed, Supreme waited. Where others panicked, he stayed calm. The 1970s also brought a cultural shift. Hip-hop was beginning to be born in the Bronx, and the idea of turning struggle into art, of transforming pain into something powerful, was spreading across the city. Kenneth grew up with this energy around him, watching his world change. And while music gave some kids a way out, Kenneth chose a different path. He saw the cracks in the system and decided to build something of his own. He started to gather like-minded friends, guys he could trust, people who shared his ambition. They weren't yet the supreme team, but the foundation was being laid. On warm summer nights, they would talk about how they were going to get money, how they were going to take over the block, how they would one day be the ones driving the cars that turned heads. Life in Queens was full of temptations. There was always someone flashing cash, someone wearing the latest fashion, someone telling stories about the money to be made running packages for older hustlers. Kenneth didn't just want to follow orders, he wanted to be the one giving them. That drive, that hunger to lead, pushed him forward. But it wasn't just greed. Kenneth was known to have a sense of pride about where he came from. He didn't just want money for himself, he wanted to elevate his crew, to make sure they all ate. People in the neighborhood would later remember him as someone who gave back, someone who would help a struggling mother pay rent or buy food for kids who didn't have enough. That duality, both feared and respected, was beginning to take shape even then. As you imagine these streets, you can feel the tension humming under the surface. A neighborhood alive with possibility and danger, a place where one wrong move could end a life, but one right move could change everything. Kenneth stood in the middle of it all, watching, learning, preparing for his moment. The world around him was rough, but it was also full of opportunity for someone willing to seize it. The 1970s gave birth to a generation of hustlers who would go on to shape the 1980s drug trade, and Kenneth Supreme McGriff would be one of the most legendary among them. The stage was set, the players were assembling, and soon, the quiet, calculating young man would step fully into the game. For now, picture him at the edge of his block, looking out toward the wider world, imagining what he could build. The streetlights buzz overhead, the air is thick with the smell of summer asphalt, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wails. This is where it all begins. This is the soil from which an empire will grow. The first steps into crime often happen quietly, almost invisibly, until one day they are no longer just steps, they are the path itself. For Kenneth McGriff, those first moves were small, almost ordinary. He was still just a teenager, but the pull of the street was strong, and the lessons he had absorbed from watching the older hustlers around him were starting to turn into action. Imagine him in the late 1970s, standing on a dimly lit corner with a couple of friends, plotting their next move. At first, it wasn't drugs. It was smaller. Hustles, boosting cars, flipping stolen goods, running errands for older guys who trusted him to deliver without skimming off the top. Kenneth understood the importance of reputation early on. If people could rely on you, if they could trust that you'd handle business without bringing heat, they would give you more responsibility. And soon enough, the work became steady. There is a certain thrill in those early hustles, the first time you hold more cash in your pocket than you've ever seen at once, the first time you realize you can make more money in a day than a straight job would pay you in a week. Kenneth felt that thrill, but he didn't let it cloud his judgment. Where others got reckless, spending everything they made on clothes and nights out, he was careful, even strategic. He reinvested, always thinking about the next move. Those who knew him back then say he was a natural leader even before the Supreme Team officially existed. Friends gravitated toward him, not just because of what he had, but because of how he thought. He had patience. He didn't move unless the timing was right. If there was trouble brewing, Kenneth would be the one to suggest waiting it out, letting things cool before making the next play. This sense of control made him stand out in a world where hot tempers often got young men killed. Eventually, like so many others, Kenneth found his way into the drug game. At first, it was small time, nickel bags of marijuana, a little powder cocaine here and there, but the demand was endless, and the money was too good to ignore. Kenneth watched how the older dealers set up shop, how they used lookouts, how they handled competition. He paid attention to the business side of things, supply chains, profit margins, the importance of keeping customers happy. The late 1970s were a transition period for New York's underworld. Heroin still held a grip on the city, but cocaine was becoming the drug of choice for a new generation, and crack was just around the corner, ready to explode onto the scene. Kenneth sensed the shift coming. He understood that those who positioned themselves early would be the ones to profit the most when the wave hit. Picture a young Kenneth, barely out of his teens, standing in a smoky apartment where deals are being made, where the air smells faintly of burnt powder and cheap liquor. He isn't talking much, just listening, watching, memorizing every move. This was his education, and he took it seriously. The police presence in South Jamaica was heavy, but Kenneth had a knack for staying one step ahead. He knew when to move product and when to hold back, when to be seen and when to disappear. He also knew the importance of keeping a low profile, something many of his peers struggled with. If someone was too flashy, too loud, Kenneth kept his distance. He wanted money, not unnecessary attention. And yet, despite his careful nature, there were still risks. The streets were unpredictable, and violence was always a possibility. A deal gone wrong could end in gunfire. A rival could show up unannounced. Even the police could turn a routine stop into a life-altering arrest. Kenneth learned to live with that tension, to operate under pressure without letting fear control him. It was around this time that his name started to carry weight. People began to call him Supreme, a name that fit the way he carried himself. There was an authority in the way he spoke, a calmness that made people listen. Supreme wasn't about chaos, he was about order, about making things run smoothly, about turning street hustle into something that felt almost organized, almost professional. But with every move upward, there was more at stake. The more money that flowed through his hands, the more eyes were on him, rivals, envious peers, and law enforcement alike. Supreme understood that if he was going to keep building, he couldn't do it alone. He needed structure, he needed people he could trust, and he needed to set rules that everyone would follow. The idea of forming a crew, a real, disciplined crew, was starting to take shape in his mind. Imagine him late at night, sitting on a project bench with a couple of close friends, talking quietly about the future. The city hums in the background, car engines and distant sirens filling the air. Supreme lays out his vision, not just to hustle, but to dominate, to take control of the entire territory. His friends nod, understanding what it means, understanding the risks. This is the moment when a teenager's dream starts to turn into a plan. The streets were about to change forever, and Kenneth, Supreme McGriff was ready to be the one changing them. Soon, he would take everything he had learned from these early hustles and turn it into something much bigger, something that would make his name known far beyond Queens. But that part of the story is still ahead. For now, we stay in this moment, on the cusp of transformation, watching as a young man prepares to take the leap from hustler to kingmaker. Every empire begins with a circle of loyal men, and for Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, this was the moment when the vision in his head became reality. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a time of change, not just for Queens but for the entire city. The drug game was shifting, and Kenneth knew the next era would belong to the ones who were organized enough to control it. He wasn't looking to be just another dealer fighting for scraps, he wanted to build something bigger, something that could last. It began quietly, with late-night conversations on park benches and in smoke-filled apartments. Kenneth would sit with the ones he trusted most, talking not just about money, but about rules, loyalty, and how they could run the streets with discipline. The crew he began to gather was made up of childhood friends, cousins, neighbors, men who knew each other, who had grown up together, who had already proven themselves. Each of them brought something different: muscle, connections, street smarts. Kenneth was careful with who he let in. Trust was everything. Imagine the scene: a small apartment living room, the curtains drawn, the hum of a box fan filling the silence. Kenneth leans forward, explaining how things are going to work. No freelancing, no chaos, no unnecessary violence. Corners would be assigned. Product would be moved efficiently. Profits would be counted and shared in a way that kept everyone motivated. It was a system, and Supreme made sure they all understood that following the system was the difference between getting rich and getting killed. This crew would eventually become known as the Supreme Team, one of the most infamous and disciplined drug organizations New York had ever seen. But in the beginning, they were just a group of young men who believed in Kenneth's vision. They looked up to him, not because he was the loudest or the most feared, but because he was the one who seemed to see the whole chessboard. The formation of the team was about more than money. It was about power and respect. Kenneth wanted to create something that would command attention, that would make rivals think twice before crossing them. And so, rules were established. Disputes were settled internally. If someone broke the code, there were consequences. Word spread quickly on the street that this was not just another crew, this was a real organization, and they meant business. With the team assembled, the operation began to expand. They locked down key corners, setting up shifts so the business could run almost around the clock. Lookouts were posted to watch for police. Runners kept the product moving, never holding more than they could afford to lose in a single bust. Money was collected, counted, and passed up the chain. Everything ran with a precision that made the Supreme Team stand out. Picture Kenneth walking through the neighborhood, not hurried, not hiding. He didn't need to shout to make his presence known. People moved out of the way, nodded in respect, whispered his name. Supreme had become a figure of authority, the kind of man whose approval could make or break someone's future. His crew followed him closely, disciplined, loyal. At the same time, this rise was not without risk. Rival crews noticed the expansion. Turf wars were a constant threat. Violence simmered just below the surface, always ready to erupt. Kenneth understood this and made sure his crew was ready. Weapons were kept close, but he was clear, they were a last resort. Violence brought police attention, and police attention was bad for business. If they had to make a move, it had to be quick, decisive, and final. This discipline became part of the Supreme Team's reputation. They weren't just feared because of what they could do, they were respected because they didn't waste energy. They handled business cleanly, efficiently, and they didn't leave loose ends. Even as the crew grew stronger, Kenneth never lost sight of the bigger picture. He reinvested in the operation, making sure they always had supply, that the quality stayed high, that customers kept coming back. He also took care of his people. If someone went to jail, their family was looked after. If someone needed help, Supreme made sure they were taken care of. This loyalty was repaid with loyalty, and it created a sense of unity that few other crews could match. The atmosphere around South Jamaica began to change. The Supreme Team's presence was felt everywhere, on the corners, in the parks, at the local hangouts. Money was flowing. Expensive cars began appearing on the block. New clothes, jewelry, sneakers, it was all a sign that the crew was eating well. But it was also a sign that they were climbing higher, and the higher they climbed, the more dangerous the game became. Imagine one of those warm summer nights, the streets buzzing with activity. The team is out in full force, moving product, watching the corners, counting money in quiet apartments. Kenneth sits back, calm, watching it all with a sense of satisfaction. This is what he had envisioned. This was the beginning of the empire. But in the quiet moments, he must have known that this was only the start, that the more successful they became, the more enemies they would face, not just other crews, but the police, the DEA, and anyone else who wanted a piece of what they had built. For now, though, Supreme's grip on the neighborhood was tightening, and the Supreme Team was growing stronger every day. The foundation had been laid, the pieces were in place, and the streets of Queens were beginning to bend to the will of Kenneth, Supreme, McGriff. The rise was underway, and soon, the whole city would know the name Supreme. The 1980s arrived like a storm over New York City. Crack cocaine swept through the boroughs like a wildfire, reshaping neighborhoods almost overnight. For those who were positioned correctly, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, a flood of demand that turned street hustlers into millionaires in a matter of months. Kenneth, Supreme, McGriff and the Supreme team were ready. They had the structure, the discipline, and the ambition to ride the wave. Imagine the first time Supreme saw just how powerful this new drug would be. The vials were small, cheap to produce, and easy to sell. A single block could generate thousands of dollars in profit in a single day. Customers lined up, sometimes forming crowds in the early hours, desperate for their next hit. The business was no longer just hustling, it was an empire, a full-scale enterprise that needed management, planning, and control. The Supreme team expanded quickly, locking down more corners, recruiting more members, and setting up shifts so operations never stopped. Lookouts whistled or shouted coded warnings if police were near, runners dashed from stash spots to dealers, and the money kept flowing in steady streams. It was a symphony of movement, each person playing a part. Supreme stood at the center, calm and calculating, making sure everything ran smoothly. The profits were staggering. Within a few years, the Supreme team was rumored to be pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. That money was visible on the streets: gold chains, fresh sneakers, top-of-the-line cars with booming sound systems. It was also invisible, funneled into safe houses, stashed under floorboards, hidden away for when the inevitable raids came. Supreme was careful. He understood that visibility was both a strength and a weakness. Too much flash would attract unwanted attention from the police and federal authorities. Picture the streets of South Jamaica at this time, corners crowded with people, cars idling with music blasting, the smell of smoke in the air. The Supreme team's reputation was at its peak. People knew that if you bought from them, you were getting quality product. They became known for consistency, something rare in the chaotic world of street dealing. But with great profit came great risk. Violence became an ever-present reality. Rival crews wanted a piece of the action, and disputes often turned deadly. The crack era was notoriously bloody, and even though Supreme tried to keep things organized, there were moments when war was unavoidable. Shootings became part of the soundtrack of the neighborhood. At night, the sound of gunfire echoed through the blocks, and the tension was palpable. Supreme's leadership style kept his crew focused. He wasn't reckless, he valued order. When violence was necessary, it was swift and decisive. But he always reminded his team that every gunshot brought police attention. And the police were watching. The NYPD's street-level units had taken notice of the rise in crack activity, and federal agencies were beginning to put South Jamaica on their radar. Surveillance vans sat quietly on side streets. Wiretaps were set up. Undercover buys were attempted. The cat-and-mouse game had begun. Despite the growing heat, Supreme's operation continued to thrive. He had built something that felt untouchable, and for a while, it was. The team's hierarchy made it hard for law enforcement to get to him directly. Even if they arrested low-level dealers, there was always someone ready to step in and take their place. The machine kept running. At the same time, the influx of money brought new pressures. Everyone wanted in. Old friends appeared, distant relatives came calling, strangers tried to attach themselves to the crew. With money came jealousy, and jealousy bred betrayal. Supreme had to be more careful than ever, not just with rivals, but with the people closest to him. Trust was the glue that held the Supreme team together, and any crack in that trust could be dangerous. For the neighborhood, the Supreme team was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the money they brought in was undeniable. Kids had new clothes. Families were quietly helped when rent came due. The crew gave back, sponsoring parties, showing generosity to those who respected them. On the other hand, the violence and addiction were impossible to ignore. Some families lost sons to overdoses, others to shootouts. Mothers buried their children while others thanked Supreme for putting food on their table. The paradox was clear: the same empire that lifted some people up was pulling others down. Kenneth McGriff knew this. He wasn't blind to the destruction that came with the money, but by then, the empire was too big to stop. The machine had to keep running, and he had to keep control. Imagine Supreme late at night, sitting in a quiet apartment, counting stacks of cash, the muffled sounds of the city outside. He must have felt both pride and pressure. Pride at what he had built, an operation that ran like a business, that made him one of the most powerful men in Queens. Pressure because he knew the law was coming, sooner or later. He knew the higher he rose, the harder the fall would be. The 1980s were the height of his reign. The Supreme Team was at full strength, the money was flowing, and their name was spoken with reverence and fear throughout the city. But under the surface, forces were gathering. Law enforcement was quietly building cases, collecting evidence, waiting for the right time to strike. Rival crews were still lurking, waiting for a chance to take a shot at the throne. For now, though, Supreme was the king of South Jamaica. The streets belonged to him, and everyone knew it. The rise was complete, the empire was alive, and the legend of Kenneth, Supreme McGriff was cemented. What no one could see yet was how quickly things could turn, how fast the same streets that crowned him would one day betray him. Power on the streets is never just about money. Money buys cars, clothes, and houses, but it doesn't guarantee loyalty. It doesn't guarantee survival. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, what kept the Supreme Team together and thriving wasn't just the cash, it was the code. An unspoken set of rules that turned a group of hustlers into a disciplined organization, one that would outlast rivals and stay strong even under relentless pressure. Supreme believed that the streets were governed by respect, and respect had to be earned, not demanded. He made it clear that anyone wearing the Supreme Team name had to conduct themselves a certain way. No unnecessary drama. No stealing from the crew. No reckless violence that would bring heat down on everyone. The team was bigger than any one man, and everyone was reminded of that. Imagine the crew gathered in a quiet apartment, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Supreme sits at the center, calm but commanding. When he spoke, people listened. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. He would lay down the rules, explain the plan, make sure everyone knew their role. There was a sense of order in those meetings, like a general briefing his soldiers before a battle. One of the most important parts of Supreme's code was loyalty. If you were part of the team, you were family. If you went to jail, your people would take care of you. If you needed money, it was there. This loyalty inspired a level of commitment that money alone could not buy. People worked harder, took bigger risks, because they knew Supreme wouldn't forget them. But the code was also unforgiving. Betrayal was dealt with swiftly and decisively. In the world Supreme ruled, snitching was the ultimate sin, and anyone caught cooperating with police was cut off, or worse. Fear was a part of the equation, but so was respect. People followed Supreme not just because they were afraid of him, but because they trusted him to keep his word, to keep the machine running, and to keep them safe as long as they stayed loyal. The streets began to see the Supreme Team not as a loose gang of dealers, but as an organized force. Corners were controlled with precision. Money moved smoothly through the chain of command. If someone caused problems, they were removed quickly, like a malfunctioning piece of a machine. This level of organization set Supreme apart from other crews, who often fell apart from infighting or sloppy mistakes. It wasn't just about discipline, it was about image. Supreme knew that perception was everything. He carried himself with quiet confidence, never rushing, never appearing desperate. When he walked through the neighborhood, people noticed. He had a reputation for taking care of those who followed his rules, and that made others want to be close to him. His presence alone kept the peace on many corners, because everyone knew the cost of crossing him. Imagine a summer afternoon, the streets busy with dealers, customers, and kids playing in the spray of a fire hydrant. A dispute breaks out, two young hustlers arguing over who gets to serve a particular corner. Before it can turn into a fight, word is sent up the chain. Supreme hears about it and sends someone trusted to handle it. The problem is solved quietly, without gunfire, without police. That was the Supreme Team way: handle business internally, keep the streets running smoothly. But the code also came with pressure. For those inside the team, there was no room for weakness. You had to prove yourself constantly. You had to show that you could be trusted, that you could make money, that you wouldn't fold under questioning if the police picked you up. The stakes were high, and those who couldn't handle it often found themselves pushed out. Supreme's system worked because it offered a strange kind of stability in an unstable world. In a neighborhood where violence could erupt without warning, where poverty made every day a struggle, being part of the Supreme Team meant protection. It meant you had a role, a purpose, and a leader who had a plan. Still, there was a darkness to it all. The same code that brought unity also demanded silence in the face of bloodshed. People on the outside sometimes saw the Supreme Team as cold, ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. And there was truth in that. To survive at the top of the drug trade, you had to be willing to make hard choices, choices that left lasting scars on the community. At night, when the corners quieted down, you can imagine Supreme reflecting on all of it: the rules, the loyalty, the cost of staying in power. He must have known that every decision carried weight, that every move he made shaped not just his own fate, but the lives of everyone connected to him. The code of the street was both armor and cage. It protected Supreme and his team, but it also trapped them in a world where leaving was nearly impossible. Once you were in for life. And as the empire grew, so did the pressure to keep everyone in line, to keep the money flowing, to keep the police guessing. This was the height of Supreme's control. The code was strong, the team was loyal, and the machine was running at full speed. But as history always shows, the higher the walls, the greater the pressure building behind them. The cracks would come, first small, then growing. And soon, the forces outside the crew would be too strong to hold back with rules and discipline alone. No matter how disciplined an empire is, the streets are never quiet for long. Power attracts challengers, and in the 1980s Queen's drug trade, there were always hungry crews ready to test the throne. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, this was the period when rivalries began to surface more aggressively, when the tension in the air became as constant as the hum of the city at night. The Supreme Team's success had made them the dominant force in South Jamaica, but that kind of dominance comes with a target. Other hustlers watched the money flow through Supreme's network and felt the pull of greed. Some were independent dealers who refused to pay tribute, who set up shop on corners claimed by the Supreme Team. Others were organized crews from neighboring blocks, looking to expand their own operations. Imagine the scene: a hot summer evening, the sidewalks crowded, the corner alive with customers. Then, a car rolls by slowly, windows half down, unfamiliar faces staring. Everyone on the corner notices. The lookouts shift nervously, runners pause mid-transaction. That one slow pass could mean a challenge, a warning, or the beginning of something much worse. Supreme understood that letting a rival encroach on his territory without response would signal weakness. He had built his reputation on control, and control had to be maintained. At first, conflicts were handled with words. Envoys were sent, warnings delivered, lines drawn in the sand. But words only went so far. In the crack era, respect was often measured in firepower. Violence became part of the Supreme Team's reality, even though Supreme himself preferred order over chaos. Street feuds flared, and bodies began to fall. The newspaper headlines called it an epidemic: gang shootings, drug-related murders, another teenager gunned down in broad daylight. For those living it, it was just survival. Picture the neighborhood during this time: mothers pulling their children inside as soon as the sun went down, the sound of rapid gunfire breaking the night, police sirens wailing as they tore through intersections. Each corner became a potential battlefield. One night, a Supreme Team dealer might be ambushed. The next day, retaliation would come swiftly, sending a message that no attack would go unanswered. These rivalries weren't just about turf, they were about pride. Losing a corner meant losing face, and losing face meant losing everything. In the world Supreme ruled, reputation was as valuable as money. To keep the empire strong, he had to show everyone that the Supreme Team was untouchable. Even with the violence escalating, there was a method to how Supreme handled business. Retaliation was planned, not random. He didn't allow his crew to go rogue, shooting wildly and bringing unnecessary heat. If a move had to be made, it was done with precision, quickly, and in a way that sent the clearest message possible. Fear, after all, was a powerful tool, but fear without control could turn into chaos. Law enforcement began to notice. Detectives from Queen's Homicide Squad started connecting the dots between bodies on the ground and the Supreme Team's rise. The NYPD's Narcotics Division began paying closer attention to South Jamaica. Unmarked cars became a regular sight. Undercover officers tried to infiltrate crews, hoping to catch someone willing to talk. But loyalty within the Supreme Team was strong, and few were willing to risk breaking the code. Still, the pressure was growing. Every shooting brought more police. Every murder brought more heat. And yet, the business didn't stop. Money was still being made, customers still lined up, and the team still ran like clockwork. For Supreme, this was the cost of doing business at the top. Imagine him during this time, sitting in a dark apartment after hearing news of another shooting. The room is quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the muffled sound of sirens outside. Supreme stays calm, weighing the options. Strike back too quickly, and the police will swarm. Wait too long, and rivals will think they have the upper hand. Every decision is heavy, every choice could shift the balance of power. There were also moments of close calls. Cars followed too closely. Shots fired near known stash spots. Friends arrested and interrogated. Each incident reminded Supreme that his empire, though powerful, was not invincible. The rivalries of this era hardened the Supreme Team. They became sharper, more cautious, more dangerous. Paranoia became part of daily life. Dealers checked over their shoulders constantly, lookouts stayed alert through the night, and everyone knew that one slip could cost them their life. The blood feuds also left their mark on the community. Families grieved, murals appeared on brick walls in memory of young men taken too soon, and the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next explosion of violence. Supreme remained focused. To him, this was all part of holding the throne. Every empire has its wars, and this was his. The streets would test him again and again, but as long as he held firm, as long as he kept his crew disciplined and loyal, the Supreme Team would survive. For now, the balance of power still leaned in Supreme's favor. The rivals had been pushed back, the corners remained under control, and the money kept flowing. But the cost of that control was rising, measured not just in dollars, but in lives. The streets were becoming more dangerous by the day, and the attention from law enforcement was reaching a breaking point. The next battle wouldn't just be with rivals on the block, it would be with the police, the DEA, and federal prosecutors determined to bring the Supreme Team down. The real war was only beginning. The streets had always been dangerous, but now the danger was coming from more than just rival crews. Law enforcement had been watching, quietly gathering evidence, building their case piece by piece. By the mid-1980s, the Supreme Team's empire was impossible to ignore. The money they made, the corners they controlled, the violence connected to their name, it had drawn the full attention of both the NYPD and federal authorities. Imagine the quiet hum of an unmarked van parked on a side street, its windows darkened, agents inside with headphones on, listening to the chatter picked up from wiretaps. Across town, detectives sit in smoke-filled offices, maps of Queens spread across desks, pushpins marking every shooting, every known stash house, every corner controlled by the Supreme Team. Slowly, a picture is forming, and at the center of that picture is Kenneth, Supreme McGriff. This was the era of the war on drugs, and New York City was one of its main battlegrounds. Politicians demanded results. Newspapers printed headlines about crack cocaine tearing communities apart. Public pressure was mounting, and law enforcement agencies were given more funding, more manpower, and more freedom to go after major players. The Supreme Team was exactly the kind of target they wanted to bring down. The NYPD's Narcotics Division began a campaign of raids and street sweeps, trying to disrupt business at every level. Small-time dealers were picked up, questioned, sometimes flipped into informants. Surveillance increased. Plainclothes officers shadowed suspected members of the team, following cars, watching handoffs, taking notes. And every time the police made a move, Supreme made adjustments. He had a talent for staying one step ahead. If a stash house got too much attention, he moved the product to a new location. If a corner was being watched too closely, he shut it down temporarily, avoiding unnecessary heat. He kept his circle tight, sharing information only with those who absolutely needed to know. The result was frustrating for investigators. Despite their efforts, Supreme himself seemed untouchable. Picture a detective sitting at his desk late at night, looking over reports, listening to wiretap recordings, and realizing that Supreme's name rarely came up directly. Orders were passed down carefully, through trusted lieutenants, leaving little evidence that could connect him to day-to-day operations. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure, but it couldn't last forever. As raids intensified, tensions in the neighborhood grew. The Supreme Team doubled their security, posting more lookouts, watching for undercover cops. Everyone was on edge. It was a cat-and-mouse game now, each side waiting for the other to slip. The police presence was constant, squad cars rolling slowly past corners, helicopters occasionally circling overhead. But despite the crackdown, business never fully stopped. The demand was too high, and the machine Supreme had built was too efficient to be dismantled so easily. If one dealer was taken off the street, another stepped in to take his place. If money was seized, more money was made the next day. Still, the pressure was real. Every arrest carried the risk that someone might talk. Every surveillance photo brought the authorities closer to understanding how the team operated. Supreme knew this, and it made him even more cautious. He relied heavily on trusted lieutenants like Prince, who kept the streets in order and shielded him from direct exposure. Imagine Supreme during this period, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen, sipping coffee, listening to reports from his team about raids, arrests, and police activity. He stays calm, his face unreadable, giving quiet instructions to shift operations, to tighten security, to keep the business moving. He knows the police are closing in, but he also knows that fear leads to mistakes. Calm is what keeps you alive. The federal agencies soon became involved. The DEA and FBI began taking an interest, working with local law enforcement to gather intelligence. This changed the game. Federal prosecutors had resources and patience. They weren't looking for quick arrests, they were building a case that could put people away for decades. They wanted to connect Supreme to the entire operation, to prove that he wasn't just a neighborhood figurehead but the leader of a major criminal enterprise. Wiretaps grew more sophisticated. Informants were planted carefully. Surveillance teams rotated to avoid detection. Each move brought them a little closer to the heart of the empire. And each move increased the pressure on Supreme to keep everything under control. For the people in South Jamaica, the neighborhood began to feel like it was under siege. Raids became more frequent. Police presence was everywhere. And yet, the streets kept moving. The Supreme Team had become too deeply rooted to be removed overnight. At night, with the corners quieter and the city lights glowing faintly in the distance, Supreme must have known the stakes were higher than ever. He had built something powerful, but now that power made him the #1 target. Every decision mattered. Every word spoken had to be chosen carefully. The wrong move could give investigators exactly what they needed. This period marked the turning point in the war between Supreme and law enforcement. The walls were closing in, but they hadn't closed completely. There was still time, still moves to make. And Supreme, ever the strategist, was determined not to go down easily. The stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter that would bring indictments, courtrooms, and the first real cracks in Supreme's control. The calm, calculating Don of South Jamaica was about to face a storm unlike anything he had seen before. No king reigns forever without interruption. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, the first real blow to his empire came in the late 1980s, when law enforcement finally moved in with enough evidence to take him off the streets. The raids, the surveillance, the wiretaps, all of it had been building to this moment. When the hammer came down, it was swift, decisive, and impossible to ignore. Picture the scene, the sun barely rising over Queens, the quiet of the morning broken by the sound of doors being battered open. Federal agents and NYPD officers pour into apartments, shouting commands, knocking down doors. Neighbors peer through curtains, watching as handcuffed men are led out, heads down, faces hard. Among them is Supreme himself. For years, he had been the calm center of the storm, untouchable, a step ahead of the law. But now he was being placed in the back of a police car, his wrists bound, the flashing red and blue lights casting harsh shadows on the walls of the neighborhood he had ruled. The streets buzzed with whispers. Some were shocked. Others smiled quietly, glad to see the king finally fall. The charges were serious: drug trafficking, conspiracy, and a host of related counts. Law enforcement had worked hard to tie Supreme to the day-to-day operations of the Supreme team. They had flipped lower-level dealers, collected testimony, and built a case strong enough to put him behind bars. In court, the atmosphere was tense. Federal prosecutors laid out their case with methodical precision, painting Supreme as the mastermind of a massive drug empire that had poisoned South Jamaica. They showed photos, played recordings, brought witnesses to the stand. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the image of Supreme as untouchable. But Kenneth was no ordinary defendant. He carried himself with the same composure he always had, even as he sat in a courtroom facing decades behind bars. To those who watched him, there was a sense of defiance in his calmness, as if he refused to give the prosecutors the satisfaction of seeing him break. Imagine the courtroom during those days, the murmur of voices before the judge entered, the rustle of papers as lawyers prepared their arguments, the steady gaze of Supreme as he listened to every word. Family members and supporters filled the benches behind him, some holding their breath, others silently praying. The press took notes furiously, eager to report on the trial of one of New York's most notorious drug figures. The verdict, when it came, was heavy. Supreme was found guilty on multiple counts. The sentence would be lengthy, long enough to take him off the streets for years. The empire he had built, brick by brick, corner by corner, would now have to survive without him at its center. Being led from the courtroom in shackles was a different kind of walk than the one he was used to taking through his neighborhood. This was a walk into a new world, the prison system, where power was measured differently, where respect was earned in other ways. Inside prison, Supreme adapted quickly. The discipline and patience that had served him so well on the streets became tools for survival. He kept a low profile, observed his surroundings, and built relationships with those who mattered. Over time, he gained respect, both from other inmates and from those who recognized his name and reputation. But prison is also a place of reflection. Imagine him sitting in a cell late at night, the lights dimmed, the muffled sounds of the prison echoing through the concrete halls. He must have thought about the streets he had left behind, about the crew still out there trying to keep things running, about the money still flowing and the enemies still circling. Letters passed back and forth between Supreme and his people on the outside. Instructions were given, advice was offered, loyalty was tested. Even from behind bars, his influence lingered, though it was not the same as walking the streets in person. The machine could keep running for a while, but cracks were starting to form. The arrest had shaken the Supreme team. Some members stayed loyal, holding things down, keeping the operation alive. Others saw the fall of their leader as an opportunity, either to leave the life behind or to try and grab a bigger piece of the pie for themselves. The unity that Supreme had built was harder to maintain without him physically there to enforce the code. In many ways, this first fall was a test, not just for Supreme, but for the entire organization. Could they survive without their leader? Could they adapt to the increased police pressure, the constant threat of arrest, the risk of betrayal from within? Supreme, for his part, focused on endurance. Prison time was something to be served, not something to be wasted. He read books, studied the system, and planned for the day he would walk out again. The thought of returning to the streets, of rebuilding what had been lost, kept him going. Yet there must have been nights when the weight of it all pressed down hard, nights when the noise of the prison faded and he was left alone with his thoughts. Power, after all, is addictive, and being cut off from it was a bitter pill to swallow. This was not the end of the story, only a pause. Supreme's fall from power was dramatic, but it was not final. There was still time, still opportunity, still moves left to make. One day, he would be free again. And when that day came, he intended to rise once more. For now, though, Kenneth, Supreme McGriff was a prisoner, the king stripped of his crown, forced to watch from a distance as the streets he once ruled moved on without him. The first chapter of his empire had ended, but the next one was already forming in his mind. Prison is often described as the great equalizer. Behind those walls, the titles and reputations of the outside world mean little, at least at first. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, entering prison was stepping into an entirely different kind of arena, one where power had to be re-established, respect had to be earned, and patience became the most valuable weapon of all. From the moment he arrived, Supreme observed everything. He watched how the prison ran, who controlled the yard, who spoke to whom, where the lines of power were drawn. He had built an empire on the outside by paying attention, by planning carefully before making a move, and prison would be no different. Imagine him in those early days, standing in line for chow, listening quietly, his eyes scanning faces, his mind working. Other inmates whispered his name, some with recognition, some with curiosity, others with a mix of fear and admiration. The legend of the Supreme Team had made its way inside long before he did, and now the man himself was here. Prison life was structured, but it was also tense. Alliances mattered. Disrespect could lead to violence. Supreme knew that his survival depended not just on staying out of trouble but on commanding respect without having to demand it. Slowly, he began to build connections. He talked with men who had influence, shared stories, listened more than he spoke. He learned which guards could be negotiated with and which ones were looking for an excuse to make someone's life harder. The routine of prison was monotonous, but Supreme used it to his advantage. Where others saw endless hours to kill, he saw time to sharpen his mind. He read constantly, history books, law books, biographies of powerful men who had risen and fallen. Knowledge became another form of power, one that would prepare him for the day he walked out free again. At night, when the noise of the cell block died down and the lights dimmed, Supreme would sit on his bunk, writing letters to his people on the outside. The words were careful, coded where necessary, but they carried instructions, encouragement, and reminders that the team had to stay strong. Even from behind bars, he maintained a level of control, though he knew it was never the same as being there in person. Prison also gave Supreme time to reflect. He thought about the choices that had brought him here, about the people he had trusted, about the enemies who had pushed for his downfall. There was anger, yes, but there was also clarity. The streets were changing fast, and if he wanted to reclaim his place when he got out, he would have to change with them. The friendships he formed inside were valuable. Prison was full of men who had knowledge to share, about the drug trade, about the legal system, about survival strategies. Supreme absorbed it all. Some of these connections would later prove useful, helping him navigate the world when he returned to the streets. Imagine the yard on a clear day, inmates walking in slow circles, some playing basketball, others clustered in small groups talking in low voices. Supreme sits on a bench, calm, his presence commanding without him having to say much. People approach him with respect, and those who sit near him know they are in the company of someone important. Over time, he built a kind of quiet authority inside. He was not reckless, he did not seek unnecessary trouble, but he was also not someone to be crossed. The discipline he had demanded from his team on the outside became a way of life for him in prison. He stayed focused, stayed sharp, and kept his eyes on the future. But prison was not just about waiting. It was also about enduring. There were moments of violence, fights that broke out, tensions that flared. There were days when lockdowns kept everyone in their cells for hours or days at a time, when the air felt heavy with frustration. Supreme endured it all with the same calm that had carried him through the chaos of the streets. The years passed slowly, but they passed. Each day brought him closer to the possibility of release. Each day was another opportunity to plan, to think about how he would rebuild. He knew the risks, law enforcement would be watching him closely when he got out, rivals might try to test him, and the game itself had changed since the day he was arrested. Crack was still everywhere, but new players had risen, new crews had claimed corners. Supreme's time inside hardened his resolve. He was determined not to fade into obscurity, not to let the name, Supreme, become just a story told about the past. He would return, and when he did, he would make sure that everyone knew the king was back. Picture the moment near the end of his sentence, Supreme sitting on his bunk, packing up the few possessions he had accumulated. The cell door clangs open, and for the first time in years, he feels the air of freedom waiting just beyond the gates. There must have been a weight in his chest, part relief, part anticipation, part quiet fire. The world outside had moved on, but Kenneth McGriff was stepping back into it with a plan. Prison had taken years from him, but it had not broken him. If anything, it had sharpened him, turned him into an even more calculating, patient, and dangerous man. The time had come to see if the empire could rise again. Freedom, after years behind bars, hits differently. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, the day he walked out of prison must have felt like stepping into a world that had been paused and then suddenly set back in motion. The air was sharper, the sky wider, and the streets noisier than he remembered. But beneath the sense of relief, there was also tension. The world had changed while he was gone, and now he had to decide how he was going to fit back into it. The first days on the outside were spent reconnecting, seeing family, visiting old friends, feeling the pulse of the neighborhood again. Queens was the same in many ways, but there were new faces on the corners, new players running blocks that used to belong to the Supreme team. Crack was still king, but the market was crowded now. Crews that had once feared Supreme had grown bold in his absence. Imagine Supreme walking down a familiar block, the pavement cracked in the same places it had always been, but the people different. Some stop and stare, whispering to each other, surprised to see him out. Others approach, offering handshakes, respect, promises of loyalty. His presence alone is enough to make the air feel charged. The king is back, and everyone knows it. But Supreme didn't rush. Prison had taught him patience, and he understood that moving too quickly could draw the kind of attention he didn't need, not just from rivals, but from law enforcement, who were certainly watching his every move. He kept his steps measured, rebuilding quietly, piece by piece, starting with the people he trusted most. Meetings were held in safe places, apartments with covered windows, back rooms of quiet spots where no one asked questions. Supreme listened more than he spoke, gathering information, finding out who was loyal, who had drifted away, who was now working with rivals. The rebuilding process wasn't just about regaining territory, it was about re-establishing respect. The Supreme team had been legendary, and now Supreme needed to remind people that the name still meant something. Slowly, he began to reassemble the structure. Old members were brought back into the fold. New, younger hustlers were recruited, trained, and tested to see if they could be trusted. Rules were reintroduced, the same rules that had once kept the streets in order. Imagine one of those meetings, a small room filled with the smell of cigarette smoke, the sound of cash being counted in the background. Supreme sits at the head of the table, his calm presence commanding attention. He lays out the plan, not with threats, but with clarity. The message is simple: we are back, we are organized, and we are not here to play games. The early moves were cautious but deliberate. Corners were reclaimed one at a time. Product was moved carefully, using the same discipline that had made the operation so effective in the past. Money began flowing again, not in the massive waves of the 1980s yet, but enough to remind everyone that the Supreme team still had teeth. But there was also something different about Supreme this time. Prison had given him perspective. He wasn't just thinking about the streets, he was thinking about legacy. He wanted more than just corners and cash. He wanted to build something that could last, something that went beyond the drug game. This is when whispers began about Supreme exploring more legitimate opportunities. There were rumors of business ventures, partnerships, and plans to step into the music world, which was booming in the late 1990s. Hip-hop had gone mainstream, and many street figures were using the industry to launder money, build brands, and gain influence outside of the block. Supreme saw the potential and began positioning himself for that move. But the streets were not going to make it easy for him. Rival crews were still around, and some of them had no intention of stepping aside quietly. There were close calls, heated arguments, tense standoffs, moments when violence seemed inevitable. Supreme had to walk a fine line, assert enough control to re-establish dominance, but avoid the all-out wars that could bring the police crashing down again. Law enforcement was watching closely, waiting for any slip-up. Surveillance teams followed his car. Informants tried to get close. Every move was being recorded, every conversation carefully monitored. Supreme knew it and adjusted his behavior accordingly, keeping things tight, refusing to expose himself unnecessarily. Imagine him late at night, sitting in a quiet living room, the glow of a lamp casting shadows on the wall. He's talking with a few trusted lieutenants, planning the next steps, mapping out which corners to reclaim next, which rivals to pressure, which alliances to strengthen. The city outside is alive with noise, but inside the room, everything is calm, methodical. Supreme is building again, not with recklessness, but with precision. Slowly, the streets began to feel his presence once more. The name, Supreme, was back in conversations, whispered on corners, mentioned in music. For some, it was a reason to be nervous. For others, it was a reason to celebrate. But even as the comeback gained momentum, there was an undercurrent of danger. The same forces that had brought him down before were still out there: police, federal agents, rivals, and they hadn't forgotten. Supreme was no longer just a local kingpin, he was a symbol, a figure whose moves carried weight far beyond Queens. The return to power was happening, but it came with risk at every turn. The empire was stirring back to life, the machine starting to hum again. But everyone knew that in the world Supreme ruled, a comeback was never simple. It was only a matter of time before the next challenge arrived, one that would test just how strong his rebuilt throne really was. By the time Kenneth, Supreme, McGriff had re-established his presence in Queens, the world outside the projects had shifted in a way that opened up entirely new opportunities. Hip-hop, once the soundtrack of block parties and street corners, had gone mainstream. Rappers were signing multi-million-dollar deals, their music videos played on television around the clock, and the culture of the streets was suddenly a global export. For Supreme, this was more than entertainment, it was a door, a chance to step beyond the shadows of the drug game and into something that could offer both money and legitimacy. The bridge between Supreme and this new world came in the form of Murder Incorporated Records, the label founded by Irv Gotti Lorenzo. Irv had grown up in Queens, too, and he understood the streets. His label was on fire, producing hit after hit, shaping the sound of late 1990s and early 2000s hip-hop with artists like Ja Rule and Ashanti. The music was about power, love, betrayal, and survival, the same themes that Supreme knew so well from real life. Imagine Supreme stepping into a recording studio for the first time. The air thick with the smell of smoke, the beat of a track thumping through the speakers, rappers in the booth laying down verses that celebrated the hustle. It must have felt familiar, even comforting. This was just another kind of empire, one built not on corners and product, but on music and influence. Rumors swirled that Supreme was not just a visitor but a silent backer, helping to fund projects, providing guidance, and connecting the label to the raw credibility of the streets. Whether those rumors were fully true or exaggerated, they fed the legend. Supreme became a name dropped in lyrics, a symbol of realness in an era where authenticity was everything. For Supreme, the music industry was an appealing move. It offered him a way to channel money into something that looked legitimate. It gave him access to a different kind of power, celebrity power, the kind that could get you invited to awards shows, the kind that could make headlines. And it gave him the chance to shape culture, to see the stories of the streets transformed into hit records that millions of people would sing along to. But the streets never stayed far away. Wherever Supreme went, his reputation followed. Some people saw him as a visionary, a man who could transition from the drug game to legitimate business. Others saw him as a threat, a reminder that no matter how polished the music industry became, it was still deeply connected to the streets. Picture one of those industry parties of the era, flashing cameras outside, luxury cars pulling up, rappers stepping out in designer suits. Inside, the room is buzzing, record executives, producers, artists, hangers-on. Somewhere in the corner, Supreme is there, calm, quiet, but drawing attention. People approach him with deference. His presence adds a certain gravity to the room, the sense that this is more than just music, this is real power. The connection to Murder Incorporated brought both opportunity and danger. On one hand, it allowed Supreme to distance himself from the day-to-day street operations and present himself as a businessman. On the other hand, it drew the attention of law enforcement in a whole new way. Federal agents, already familiar with his name, now saw him moving in circles that generated millions of dollars in revenue. To them, this looked like the perfect cover for laundering drug money. Investigations ramped up again. Surveillance extended beyond the corners of Queens into the offices of record labels, the studios where music was made, the clubs where deals were discussed. The feds were convinced that Supreme was using the music industry as a front, and they were determined to prove it. This period of Supreme's life was marked by duality. By day, he was meeting with music executives, talking about projects, building connections with artists. By night, he was still a figure of power in the streets, still respected, still feared. It was a delicate balance, one foot in legitimacy, one foot in the world that had made him who he was. Imagine him sitting in a plush office chair at Murder Incorporated. Headquarters, gold and platinum records lining the walls, listening to a new track that referenced the hustle. There must have been pride there, pride that his story, his world, had become part of the culture, immortalized in music. But there must have also been unease. Supreme knew better than anyone that the brighter the spotlight, the more dangerous the game became. The higher you climbed, the more people wanted to see you fall, rivals, law enforcement, even those within your own circle. The partnership with Murder Incorporated helped elevate Supreme's legend to new heights. His name was not just whispered on street corners anymore, it was wrapped in verses that blasted from car stereos and club speakers across the country. To some, he became almost mythical, a symbol of the perfect blend of street power and cultural influence. Yet, in the background, the storm clouds were gathering again. Federal prosecutors were quietly building another case, one that would attempt to connect Supreme not just to drugs, but to murder-for-hire plots and large-scale money laundering. The stage was being set for another confrontation, one that would be even bigger and riskier than before. For now, though, Supreme was living in the space between two worlds. He was free, he was respected, and he was carving out a role in an industry that gave him the chance to rewrite his narrative. The question was how long he could keep both worlds in balance before one of them collapsed. No matter how far Kenneth, Supreme, McGriff tried to step into legitimacy, the streets never let go completely. Queens still remembered his name, and power on the block was always contested. The 1990s and early 2000s were years of shifting alliances, new crews rising, and old grudges resurfacing. The empire Supreme had once built was no longer as solid as it had been in the 1980s, and every move he made was watched closely, by rivals and by law enforcement alike. Imagine a summer evening in South Jamaica, the streets buzzing with music from passing cars, kids running through the spray of an open hydrant, corner boys watching from stoops. In the middle of all this energy, rumors circulate: Supreme is back, he's reorganizing, he's making moves again. Those whispers carry weight. For some, it's exciting, the promise of order returning to a chaotic scene. For others, it's a threat, a sign that their newfound power might soon be challenged. Old rivalries were never truly buried, only put on hold. As Supreme's name began to reappear on the streets, those who had stepped up during his absence started to feel the pressure. Corners that had been taken over now had to be defended. Crews that had grown comfortable now had to decide whether to align with Supreme, stay independent, or openly oppose him. Tension began to simmer. Picture a tense meeting in a quiet apartment, Supreme sitting across from a local figure who has been running a block in his absence. The conversation is calm, measured, but the air is thick with unspoken threats. Supreme explains that things are changing, that the corner needs to fall back under his control. The rival nods, says he understands, but outside, his crew is already talking about whether they're willing to give up ground. This was the dangerous dance of the streets. Every corner represented money, and money meant survival. Giving up territory wasn't just a business decision, it was a matter of pride. Some rival crews chose to push back, and violence began to flare again. Shootings in the night, cars rolling past and spraying bullets into parked vehicles, bodies dropping on corners where deals had gone bad. The violence brought back memories of the bloody crack era, when the Supreme team had fought to keep control. But this time was different. The neighborhood had changed, the police presence was heavier, and the stakes were even higher. Every shooting drew media attention, every incident gave federal agents more reason to ramp up their investigations. Supreme, by now older and more seasoned, tried to avoid open warfare when possible. He understood that too much bloodshed would only bring the law down harder. But even with careful planning, the streets have a way of pulling men back into conflict. A disrespect here, a robbery there, each incident demanded a response, because to ignore it would be seen as weakness. Imagine Supreme late at night, hearing the news that one of his people has been shot. He sits quietly for a moment, weighing the options. Retaliation would send a message, but it would also risk escalation. Waiting might cool things down, but it could embolden rivals. This was the dilemma of leadership on the streets: every decision had consequences, and hesitation could be fatal. At the same time, new players were emerging. Younger crews who hadn't grown up under Supreme's rule were less fearful of his name. They were eager to prove themselves, eager to carve out their own legends, and some were willing to test him directly. For a man trying to walk a line between legitimacy and the streets, this was a dangerous position. Law enforcement took notice of every flare-up, adding it to their growing files. Detectives sat in precinct offices connecting dots, prosecutors prepared grand jury presentations, and federal agents discussed conspiracy charges. Each act of violence was another brick in the wall they were building against Supreme. The pressure created a sense of paranoia. Everyone had to be watched: rivals, allies, even friends. Betrayal was always a possibility, and Supreme knew from experience that the higher the stakes, the more likely someone would try to flip to save themselves. For the community, this resurgence of conflict was both familiar and exhausting. Some people longed for the order Supreme had once imposed, while others prayed for peace, wishing that all the crews would disappear and let the neighborhood breathe. Murals honoring the dead began to appear on brick walls again, candles lit on sidewalks where young men had fallen. Despite the tension, Supreme continued to maneuver carefully. He was no longer just a street boss, he was also a man with ties to the music industry, with his name in headlines, with law enforcement monitoring his every move. He had to be smarter, quieter, more strategic than ever before. But even with all his caution, the storm was building. The streets were becoming hotter, the investigations deeper, and the line between survival and destruction thinner by the day. The next chapter would not just be about rival crews, it would be about the full weight of federal prosecution bearing down on him, determined to end the story of Supreme once and for all. By the early 2000s, the streets were no longer Supreme's only problem. The quiet shadow of law enforcement had grown into something much larger, something impossible to ignore. The federal government had been watching him for years, patiently connecting the dots, and now they were ready to make their move. This was no longer a local issue. It was no longer just the NYPD. This was the full weight of federal law enforcement focused on Kenneth, Supreme McGriff. Imagine a conference room deep inside a federal building, agents from the FBI, DEA, and ATF sitting around a table covered in photographs, wiretap transcripts, and maps of Queens. On the wall, there are surveillance images, Supreme leaving a building, Supreme talking with associates, Supreme spotted at music industry events. The case they were building wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about murder for hire, racketeering, and criminal enterprise. The investigation became relentless. Wiretaps were placed on phones, including those of people connected to Supreme's circle. Conversations were monitored, coded language analyzed by experts. Meetings were followed, vehicles tailed for miles. Surveillance teams sat for hours in unmarked cars, watching from a distance, taking pictures, writing reports. Every move Supreme made was observed. And yet, even under this level of scrutiny, Supreme kept his composure. He had survived the streets, survived prison, survived rivals who had tried to kill him. This was just another battle to fight. He stayed cautious, kept his circle tight, and continued to operate with discipline. But even the most careful man cannot escape the pressure forever. Imagine Supreme late at night, sitting in a quiet room with his most trusted people, the blinds drawn, a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. They talk about the growing heat, the rumors of grand juries being convened, the possibility of indictments. Everyone knows what it means. Everyone knows that the next time the knock comes on the door, it might be the one that ends everything. The federal government's case went beyond drug dealing. They were linking Supreme to acts of violence, to alleged contract killings that prosecutors argued were meant to protect his business and eliminate rivals. These allegations turned the case into something even more explosive, no longer just a drug conspiracy, but an organized crime prosecution with the potential for life sentences. For the streets, the news spread like wildfire. Some people whispered that Supreme was untouchable, that he would beat the case like he had beaten trouble before. Others believed this time was different, that the government was determined to make an example out of him. The tension in Queens grew thicker by the day. Even as the investigation reached its peak, Supreme kept moving. He was still seen at industry events, still connected to Murder Incorporated, still involved in projects that blurred the line between business and legend. But those events became risks, every handshake, every conversation could be monitored, every public appearance a chance for federal photographers to capture him standing next to someone the prosecutors would later name as a co-conspirator. Picture the neighborhood under this cloud, corners quieter, people more careful about what they said, about who they were seen with. Informants were rumored to be everywhere. Trust became even more precious, and paranoia set in. Even among loyal friends, there was always the question, who might be talking to the feds? The pressure finally began to show in the form of indictments. Federal prosecutors announced sweeping charges, naming Supreme and several associates in a complex case that accused them of running a continuing criminal enterprise, committing acts of murder for hire, and laundering money through the music industry. The headlines were sensational. The image of Supreme as a man who had turned his life around was shattered in the public eye. Court dates were set. Defense attorneys prepared to challenge the government's narrative, arguing that the case was built on unreliable witnesses, on informants motivated by deals, on circumstantial evidence. Supreme, as always, carried himself with composure, walking into court with the same quiet confidence that had defined him since the beginning. But the threat was real. This was no longer about a few years in prison. This was about life. If convicted, Supreme could spend the rest of his days behind bars. The stakes had never been higher. Imagine the courtroom filled with spectators, the press lined up in the back, the prosecutors speaking in measured tones as they laid out their case. The weight of the government's resources was apparent. This was not just a trial, it was a message, a statement that no one, not even a figure as powerful as Supreme, was beyond the reach of federal law. At night, after the hearings were over, Supreme must have sat with the reality pressing on him. This was not the same as his first arrest, not the same as his first trial. This was the kind of case that could erase everything, that could take not just his freedom but his legacy. And yet, there was no panic, no outward sign of fear. He had built an empire once before. He had faced down enemies and survived. If this was going to be his final battle, he would face it with the same calm that had carried him this far. The walls were closing in, the circle tightening. The Supreme Team was no longer the unstoppable force it once was. Members were flipping, deals were being made, secrets were being revealed under oath. The stage was set for the trial that would determine the rest of Supreme's life. Courtrooms have their own rhythm, their own atmosphere. The air feels heavier, the silence deeper, the smallest sound echoing off wood-paneled walls. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, stepping into that space day after day was a test of will unlike anything he had faced on the streets. This was not a shootout, not a corner war. This was a slow, methodical fight for his life, with every word spoken carrying the power to seal his fate. From the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, sketch artists captured the scene, and spectators crowded in to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had become legend. Supreme walked in each day calm, dressed sharply, his head held high. There was no fear in his face, no sign of panic. If this was to be the last battle, he would fight it with dignity. The prosecution laid out its case carefully. They argued that Supreme was the leader of a criminal enterprise responsible not just for drug trafficking but for multiple killings. The centerpiece of their case was the allegation of murder for hire, that Supreme had ordered the execution of rivals and potential informants to protect his empire. The prosecutors played taped conversations, read from transcripts, and presented witness after witness. Many of those witnesses were former associates, men who had once stood beside Supreme but had since turned government informants. They took the stand, pointed him out, told the jury stories of late-night meetings, coded conversations, and whispered orders that led to bloodshed. Each testimony was like a dagger aimed at the defense. Imagine sitting in that courtroom, listening to one of these witnesses describe, in calm detail, how a target was identified, how the hit was planned, how the payment was made. The jurors leaned forward, taking notes, their faces grim. The prosecutors painted a picture of Supreme as a man who wielded death like a tool, a man who removed threats with cold precision. The defense fought back fiercely. Supreme's lawyers argued that the witnesses were liars, men who had made deals to save themselves from long prison sentences. They reminded the jury that there was no direct physical evidence linking Supreme to the murders, only the words of men who stood to benefit from testifying. They attacked the credibility of each government witness, pointing out inconsistencies, suggesting ulterior motives. Still, the weight of the case was heavy. The prosecution had spent years building it, and their narrative was compelling. They showed photos of crime scenes, held up shell casings, pointed to the grieving families sitting in the gallery. They spoke of justice, of bringing peace to a community torn apart by violence. Imagine Supreme during these moments, sitting quietly at the defense table, listening as prosecutors described him as a ruthless kingpin, a man who ordered death from a distance. His expression never changed. Those who were there said he was unreadable, as if he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing what he felt inside. As the trial stretched on, the tension grew heavier. Each day brought new revelations, new accusations. Outside the courthouse, reporters filed daily stories, headlines splashed across newspapers and television screens. The image of Supreme as a music industry figure and businessman was fading, replaced by the darker portrait painted by the government. When the trial reached closing arguments, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The prosecutors delivered a powerful summation, telling the jury that they had the chance to stop a man who had terrorized the streets for years. The defense countered by reminding the jury that reasonable doubt was the standard, that a man's life hung in the balance, and that they could not convict based on the words of men who had every reason to lie. The jury deliberated for hours, then days. Each time the courtroom was called back to session, hearts raced, wondering if this would be the moment the verdict came. Finally, the jurors filed back in, their faces solemn. The courtroom grew silent, every eye fixed on the foreperson. Guilty. The word landed like a hammer. Count after count was read, and each time, the same verdict. Guilty. 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 Supreme sat still, absorbing it all, showing no outward reaction even as the weight of a life sentence settled on his shoulders. Around the room, gasps, whispers, and muffled sobs filled the air. For the prosecutors, it was a victory years in the making. For Supreme's family and supporters, it was a devastating moment. Some cried openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. Imagine Supreme being led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the chain at his waist rattling softly, the press cameras flashing as he was taken away. This was the end of the trial, the end of the fight, and for many, the end of an era. That night, Queens was quiet. Some celebrated, saying justice had been served. Others mourned, not just for Supreme, but for what his fall represented, the final dismantling of a figure who had once held their neighborhood together, for better or worse. Inside his cell that night, Supreme must have replayed the trial in his mind. The testimony, the evidence, the faces of the jurors as they spoke the verdict. This was not just a sentence, it was a closing of a door. The life he had lived, the empire he had built, the power he had once wielded, it was all behind him now. But even in defeat, Supreme's story was not over. The legend of Kenneth, Supreme McGriff would continue to echo through the streets, through the music that still carried his name, through the conversations of those who remembered what it had meant when he ruled. The trial had ended, but the myth was just beginning to grow. Prison feels different when you know you're never leaving. For Kenneth, Supreme McGriff, the reality of a life sentence was not just the clanging of cell doors or the endless counts by guards. It was the knowledge that the world outside would go on without him, that the streets he had once ruled would change, grow older, and forget his footsteps. It was a kind of exile, one that demanded a new way of existing. The first nights after the verdict must have been the hardest. Imagine Supreme sitting on the edge of his bunk, the cell silent except for the distant sounds of other inmates talking through bars, the faint echo of footsteps on concrete floors. He had faced so many battles in his life, but this one had no way out. There would be no corner to reclaim, no empire to rebuild. The judge's words had been final, life without parole. And yet, even here, Supreme carried himself with composure. Those who encountered him in prison described a man who still had presence, still commanded respect. He was not broken, not bitter in a way that made him reckless. He remained calm, disciplined, deliberate. In a world where chaos often reigned, Supreme was steady. Prison became his new kingdom, in its own way. The yard was different from the corners of Queens, but it had its own order, its own hierarchy. Supreme navigated it carefully, building quiet alliances, keeping conflicts to a minimum. Younger inmates gravitated toward him, drawn by his reputation, listening to his advice. He spoke about discipline, about patience, about the importance of thinking before you act, lessons he had lived by on the streets. Imagine him walking slowly around the yard during recreation, his hands behind his back, the sky above a dull gray. Other men nod as he passes, a sign of respect. Some approach to talk, to ask questions, to seek counsel. Supreme listens, gives his words sparingly, but when he speaks, people pay attention. Letters became his connection to the outside world. He wrote to family, to friends, to those who had once stood beside him. Some letters were practical, advice, reflections, encouragement to stay strong. Others were more philosophical, musings about life, about loyalty, about the choices that had led him here. In these letters, a more thoughtful side of Supreme emerged, a man who had time to look back at his past and weigh its meaning. The music industry he had once been connected to continued to reference him, his name living on in lyrics, his story becoming part of hip-hop's mythology. From his cell, Supreme must have heard about these songs, these mentions, and felt a complicated pride. His legacy was alive, even if his physical freedom was gone. Prison life was not without its challenges. There were lockdowns, tensions, moments of violence that reminded everyone how dangerous the environment could be. But Supreme stayed steady, keeping himself out of unnecessary trouble. He had nothing left to prove. Nighttime in prison carries a special weight. When the lights go out and the noise dies down, there is nothing but time to think, to remember, to regret, to dream. Supreme had built an empire once. He had been a king, feared and respected, and now he was a man in a cell, living out the rest of his days under the watchful eye of guards. And yet, there is something strangely eternal about men like Supreme. Even as the years passed, even as the seasons changed outside those walls, his story continued to circulate. New generations heard about him, studied him, debated whether he had been a villain, a visionary, or both. Imagine him sitting at a small desk in his cell, pen in hand, writing late into the night. Perhaps he was writing about the code he had lived by, about loyalty and betrayal, about the lessons the streets had taught him. Perhaps he was thinking about how he might be remembered, not just as a kingpin, but as a man who had risen from nothing, who had carved out power with his own hands. Prison had taken away his freedom, but it had not erased his name. Outside, people still spoke of him. Some cursed him, blaming him for the damage done to their community. Others admired him, seeing him as a symbol of survival, a man who had played the game at the highest level and refused to bow down. Life behind bars became a strange mix of routine and reflection. Supreme rose each day, followed the schedule, did his time. But in his mind, the story was still alive. The empire might have fallen, but the legend remained. And perhaps, in some quiet way, Supreme found a kind of peace. There were no corners to defend anymore, no rivals to outthink, no police to evade. The wars were over. All that was left was the man himself, stripped of power but not stripped of dignity, living out his days with the same calm he had always carried. Time has a way of turning men into myths. As the years passed and Kenneth, Supreme, McGriff remained behind bars, his story began to shift from present-day reality into legend. In South Jamaica, Queens, his name still carried weight, spoken in hushed tones on corners, mentioned with a mix of respect, fear, and nostalgia. For some, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how power can lead to downfall. For others, he was a symbol of order, a man who had once kept the neighborhood running with a strict code that, in its own way, felt like justice. Walk through South Jamaica even years after Supreme's imprisonment and you'll still find echoes of his reign. The older generation tells stories about how the Supreme team kept the blocks organized, about how Supreme would help struggling families, about the summer block parties he sponsored where kids danced to booming music and the whole community came out. There is a bittersweet quality to those memories. People recall both the good and the bad, the sense of safety mixed with the knowledge that it all came at a price. Imagine a group of young men standing outside a corner store, trading stories they've heard from their older brothers or uncles. They talk about the cars Supreme used to drive, the way he dressed, the discipline he demanded from his crew. Some of them speak with admiration, wishing they had seen those days for themselves. Others shake their heads, pointing out the bodies that fell, the families broken by addiction. Supreme's influence reached far beyond Queens. In hip-hop, his name became almost immortal. Rappers referenced him in lyrics, using his story as a symbol of power, resilience, and ambition. Some saw him as the blueprint for how to rise from nothing and build an empire. Others used his fall as a warning, a reminder that the game always ends the same way, dead or in prison. Picture a recording studio in the early 2000s, a rapper in the booth laying down a verse that shouts out Supreme, honoring the legacy of the Supreme team. The beat pounds, the words drip with reverence, and somewhere far away, in a prison cell, Supreme's name continues to circulate through the culture, refusing to fade. For the community, his legacy is complex. There are mothers who will never forgive him, who lost sons to the violence that came with the crack era. There are former addicts who see him as part of the reason their lives fell apart. And there are those who credit him with bringing a sense of order during a chaotic time. Who say that when Supreme ran the neighborhood, there were rules, and people knew where they stood. Murals have appeared over the years, some celebrating his name, others memorializing the victims of the drug wars. Both tell a story of a time when the streets of Queens were a battleground and Supreme was at the center of it all. The very landscape of the neighborhood feels like it remembers him. Beyond Queens, criminologists and urban historians discuss Supreme's story as a case study in organized street power. The Supreme team was different from most crews of its era, more disciplined, more structured, almost corporate in the way it operated. Supreme's leadership is analyzed not just as criminal, but as a form of community governance, filling a vacuum left by systems that had failed the neighborhood. Imagine a college lecture hall where a professor is discussing the crack era and uses the Supreme team as an example. Students take notes, some fascinated, some horrified. Supreme's name becomes part of academic study, part of the history of New York City's struggle with drugs and violence. Inside prison, Supreme is aware of this ongoing conversation about his life. In interviews and statements, he has sometimes reflected on his past, offering thoughts on loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of power. These glimpses add depth to the legend, reminding people that behind the headlines and the myth, there is still a man, one who has had decades to think about everything that happened. The duality of Supreme's memory keeps the legend alive. To some, he is the street don, the man who turned chaos into order and built a fortune from nothing. To others, he is a symbol of the destruction caused by the drug trade, a man whose decisions left lasting scars on his community. And yet, in this tension lies the fascination. People are drawn to the story not just because of the crime, but because of the humanity behind it, the ambition, the discipline, the rise, the fall. Supreme represents both the possibility of transcending your environment and the danger of being consumed by it. Imagine walking through Queens late at night, the streetlights casting long shadows, the hum of the city in the distance. Somewhere in the quiet, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the sound of engines idling, of lookouts whistling, of deals being made under the cover of darkness. Supreme's name lingers there, part of the DNA of the place, part of its memory. Even in prison, Supreme's influence hasn't completely faded. Young hustlers still use his name as a point of reference, still speak about his discipline, still measure themselves against the myth of what he built. And in hip-hop, his story continues to inspire verses, documentaries, and debates. Kenneth Supreme McGriff is no longer walking the streets, no longer giving orders, no longer the man who could make entire blocks move with a single command. But in a way, he is still present. His story lives on in the neighborhood, in the music, in the cautionary tales told to the next generation. And perhaps that is what makes his legacy so enduring. It is not just about crime or punishment. It is about power, about the human drive to rise, about the cost of ambition. It is about a man who became more than a man, who became a symbol, one that still casts a long shadow over Queens. Every story like Kenneth Supreme McGriff's carries lessons about power, ambition, and the price that must always be paid. As the years have passed, his life has become something larger than the man himself, a kind of mirror held up to the streets and to anyone who has ever been tempted by the promise of quick money and fast respect. It is worth slowing down here, taking a breath, and considering what his rise and fall really mean. Supreme's story begins with ambition, the kind of ambition that burns brightest in those who grow up with very little. He looked around at a neighborhood filled with struggle, poverty, and limited opportunity, and he refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. He saw the game as a way to escape, a way to not just survive but thrive. In that sense, his drive was universal. The details may have been tied to the streets, but the hunger to rise above one's circumstances is something that resonates far beyond Queens. But ambition is a double-edged sword. It can build empires, but it can also consume the builder. Supreme's discipline, his vision, his ability to organize and lead, those qualities could have made him successful in any field. Yet the field he chose was one where the cost of success was measured in blood and prison time. Each decision to expand the business, each corner claimed, each rival pushed aside brought him closer to the inevitable reckoning. Imagine him in the early days, just starting to gather his team, feeling that surge of pride as he watched his vision come to life. There must have been a sense of invincibility, a belief that through planning and discipline, he could control everything, the money, the streets, even fate. For a while, he did. And that is another lesson: power can work like a drug. The more you have, the more you believe you can never lose it. Supreme's code of loyalty was legendary, and it kept the Supreme team together through some of the most dangerous years of the crack era. He rewarded those who stayed true, and he punished betrayal without hesitation. This code created order in a world that might otherwise have been pure chaos. But loyalty, too, has a cost. It meant that everyone in the circle was tied to each other's choices, for better or worse. When the law came knocking, when indictments were handed down, those same ties pulled many men down together. For the listener, there is a haunting truth here: the very qualities that make someone powerful, loyalty, ambition, fearlessness, can also lead them into ruin if they are not tempered by wisdom and restraint. Supreme's story is not simply one of crime, it is a story about human nature, about the dangerous pull of power and the challenge of controlling it once you have it. There is also a lesson about systems. Supreme rose because there was space for him to rise. The decline of jobs, the neglect of neighborhoods, the lack of opportunity all created a vacuum that the drug trade filled. When legitimate systems fail, other systems emerge, and men like Supreme become both the product of their environment and its ruler. His empire was not built in isolation, it was part of a larger story about New York City in the 1980s, about the crack epidemic, about a city fighting for its soul. Imagine Queens at night, decades later. The streets are quieter now, but the ghosts of that era remain. The lampposts that once lit up corners filled with lookouts now cast their light on empty sidewalks. The buildings that once housed stash spots now hold families trying to live ordinary lives. Supreme's story lingers there, a reminder that history is never as far away as it seems. There is, too, a personal lesson. Supreme's time in prison has given him years to reflect, to write, to think about what he built and what it cost. His interviews show a man who understands the weight of his decisions, who has seen the faces of those who were hurt, who knows the damage that was done. Whether or not he would do it all differently if given the chance is something only he can answer, but the reflection itself is meaningful. It shows that even those who once seemed larger than life are still human, still capable of regret, still capable of growth. For the listener, these reflections invite a question: what do we value most? Is it power, respect, money, or is it freedom, peace, and the ability to live without fear? Supreme's story suggests that the first set of values can be intoxicating, but they often come at the cost of the second. And yet, there is inspiration here as well. Supreme's life is a testament to the power of vision, of discipline, of the ability to turn an idea into reality. If those same qualities can be channeled toward building rather than destroying, toward lifting up rather than tearing down, they can transform lives and communities. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all, that greatness is not in what you control, but in what you create. Supreme created something undeniable, something that left a mark on history. The tragedy is not that he built it, but that it came with a cost so high that he will pay it for the rest of his life. As you sit with this story, let the weight of those lessons settle in. Think about the rise, the power, the downfall, and the reflection. Think about what it means to chase a dream, what it means to win, and what it means to lose everything. Supreme's story is not just about him, it is about all of us, about the choices we make, and the paths we choose to walk. Every great story leaves behind unanswered questions, and Kenneth, Supreme McGriff's life is no exception. Even after the indictments, the trials, the verdicts, there are parts of his story that remain shrouded in mystery, rumors that still circulate, theories that still fuel late-night conversations, and moments that will likely never be fully explained. These lingering questions are part of what keeps his legend alive. One of the biggest mysteries surrounds the murder-for-hire allegations that sealed Supreme's fate. The government argued that he had orchestrated killings to eliminate rivals and protect his empire, but some still debate how much of that case was built on truth and how much was built on testimony from men who were bargaining for their own freedom. Were all of the hits truly ordered by Supreme? Or was he blamed for crimes he didn't commit simply because of the power of his name? Imagine sitting in a Queens barbershop years later, the hum of clippers in the background as older men debate this very question. One swears that Supreme was too smart to get his hands dirty that way, that he let others handle the violence and kept himself removed. Another insists that he had to be involved. No one in that world could rise as high as he did without getting blood on their hands. The argument goes in circles, with no clear resolution, because the truth lives only in the memories of those who were there, and many of them are gone. There are also the financial mysteries, the whispers of hidden money, of investments quietly made during the peak of the Supreme team's power, of cash that never surfaced even after law enforcement seized millions. Some believe that Supreme left behind a fortune, carefully tucked away, waiting for the right time or the right person to reclaim it. Others think that the government took everything, that there is nothing left but the legend. Then there are the questions about the connection between Supreme and the music industry. Just how deep did his involvement with Murder Incorporated go? Was he truly funding projects, or was his name simply being used to add credibility to the label's image? The federal government painted one picture, but those inside the industry sometimes tell a different story, one where Supreme was a supporter, a mentor, a man who saw the potential of music as a way out of the cycle of crime. Imagine Supreme sitting in his cell, reading headlines about his alleged involvement with the label, shaking his head, perhaps even smiling to himself at the exaggerations. Only he knows the full truth, and perhaps he will never share it completely. Even his personal reflections add to the sense of mystery. Over the years, Supreme has given interviews and made statements about his life, but they are measured, careful, revealing just enough to keep people interested while leaving plenty unsaid. It is as if he understands that part of what keeps his story alive is the space he leaves open for others to fill with speculation. There are also questions about loyalty, who stayed true to him, who betrayed him, who cooperated with the government. The case was built on testimony from insiders, but in the world Supreme came from, betrayal was the ultimate sin. People still wonder who flipped, who talked, who turned to save themselves. These are questions that still cause tension in Queens, decades later. Imagine a quiet conversation on a stoop, two men in their 40s talking about the old days, lowering their voices when certain names come up. There is still pain there, still anger, still a sense that some wounds never fully heal. Even Supreme's own future is something of a mystery. Serving a life sentence means he will never walk the streets as a free man again, at least not under current circumstances. But some hold out hope that laws might change, that appeals might one day offer him a chance at release. It is unlikely, but the possibility keeps the conversation alive, keeps the legend from closing entirely. The mysteries surrounding Supreme's life create an almost mythic quality, blurring the line between fact and folklore. Some things we will never know, exactly how much money flowed through the Supreme team's hands, exactly who made which decisions, exactly how far Supreme's influence stretched. Perhaps that is fitting. Legends are meant to have shadows, meant to have spaces where the imagination can wander. And so the story lingers. People debate it in barbershops and corner stores, in college classrooms and online forums. Rappers continue to weave his name into lyrics. Documentaries continue to be made. Each generation rediscovers Supreme's story and finds something new in it, an example, a warning, a source of fascination. Imagine Queens late at night, the streets empty, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Somewhere, someone is telling a young man about Supreme, about the days when the Supreme team ran the block, about the discipline, the fear, the money, the downfall. The young man listens, wide-eyed, caught between awe and caution. The story has not ended, it has simply taken on a life of its own. Every story must end, even one as layered and complex as Kenneth, Supreme McGriff's. As we come to the quiet close of his tale, the noise of the streets begins to fade, the flashing lights dim, and the rush of headlines becomes distant. What remains is a man, a life, a legacy, one that has left a mark on Queens, on hip-hop, and on the history of the American underworld. Supreme's journey began with ambition, with the dream of rising above the circumstances he was born into. He turned that dream into reality, building an organization that was as feared as it was respected. For a time, he controlled the rhythm of South Jamaica, his name enough to make people move, to make rivals think twice, to make law enforcement work overtime just to catch up. His rise was fast, calculated, and undeniable. But power, as it always does, came with a price. The corners he claimed, the rivals he faced, the money he made, all of it drew attention, from enemies on the street and from the government determined to bring him down. The very success that made him a legend also set the stage for his downfall. Imagine Supreme now, older, sitting in a prison cell late at night. The lights are low, the air quiet, the world outside far away. He has had years to think, to look back on the choices that brought him here. Perhaps he remembers the first time he held a handful of money from an early hustle, the first time someone called him Supreme. Perhaps he remembers the streets of Queens in the summer heat, the music playing, the deals being made. Perhaps he remembers the faces, friends, allies, enemies, and wonders where they are now, what became of them. Reflection comes slowly in the silence. There is pride, surely, in what he built, in the discipline and vision it took to turn a small hustle into a sprawling network. But there may also be regret, for the lives lost, for the damage done, for the years spent behind bars when freedom was just beyond reach. For the listener, this is where the story softens, where it invites a moment of stillness. Supreme's life was full of noise, sirens, gunfire, courtroom gavel strikes, but here, at the end, there is only quiet. His story reminds us that even the most powerful figures are still human, still vulnerable to fate, still capable of reflection. The neighborhood he once ruled continues on. Children grow up on those same streets, unaware of the history under their feet. Some will hear his name in passing, maybe in a rap verse, maybe in a story told by someone who lived through those days. For them, he will be a figure out of legend, distant, larger than life, a cautionary tale and an inspiration all at once. Supreme's story is about more than crime. It is about ambition, leadership, loyalty, and the choices that define a life. It is about how a single person can shape the destiny of a neighborhood, and how that neighborhood, in turn, can shape them. It is about how power can build and destroy, how respect can elevate and isolate, how every empire eventually faces its reckoning. Imagine Queens tonight, the streetlights glowing softly, the sound of traffic in the distance. The corners that once belonged to the Supreme team are quiet. The world has moved on, but in some way, his shadow is still there, stretching across time. The story of Supreme is not just a story of the past, it is a thread in the fabric of the city, a reminder that the streets remember. As you lay back and let the weight of this story settle, let yourself drift into that quiet. The noise is gone now. The rise, the rain, the fall, they have all been told. What remains is reflection, the gentle understanding that life is a series of choices, and each one carries its own price. Close your eyes and picture it one last time, the man who was once supreme, calm and composed, sitting with his thoughts as the night deepens. The world outside moves on, but his name lingers, his story still being told, still teaching, still warning, still inspiring. And with that, the tale comes to an end, leaving only the soft echo of memory. The streets are still, the night is calm, and you can rest, knowing you have walked through history and seen the rise and fall of a man who turned himself into a legend.